Hello and welcome to another live stream from Test Oil. This one's subject is General Oil Analysis Report Reading, or what I like to call how to read a report in 2 minutes or less. In this presentation, I'll show you the basic mechanics of how to get through any oil analysis report in a timely and efficient manner so that we can arrive at a point where we can decide on the next actionable items. Now, before I begin showing you that, I'd like to take you through a report in a way that I find many people read reports that points out some of the inefficiencies along the way. So for our first example, we'll do it what we call the old way. Now, the report that I'm going to show you here is broken up across 3 slides, just so it's nice and big that you can read it. So let's take a look at the top half of the first page. On this report, you'll notice that there's a couple of highlighted values, and that tends to be where most people's eyes will go. Some people may read the comments that are on the report near the top, but generally they will settle on those highlighted values. And they'll see that there's a level of iron and a level of lead that are much higher than the previous history. As they continue reading the report to the next part of the first page, they will also see a couple more highlighted values, in this case particle count and water. At this point, you've already got an idea that things are not looking good. We've got wear metals, we've got contaminants. On the second page, though, the last part of the report, they will eventually see some ferrography results. And from the ferrography, they will notice that there is a lot of wear particles of different types. And again, we're identifying contaminants. So at this point, you may have an idea what you think is going on wrong with this equipment. But let me see if through that quick run through, you made some of the same mistakes that I find are quite common. For the first normal mistake that most people make is that at the top of the report, when they see that iron and lead, they're already trying to decide where does it come from. So ask yourself that question. Did you try to interpret that as where was this wear metal coming from? If you did, that's mistake number 1, which we call interpreting on the fly. As you interpret the report with each new piece of information, you're wasting a lot of time reinterpreting what you've already interpreted because you keep adding new information. So I encourage people always wait for the whole picture, right? Try and avoid that interpreting on the fly. And the reason for that is that sometimes at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what kind of wear metals you might see in your oil analysis report. You probably already have an idea what went wrong. Second common mistake, though, when you're looking at the report, did you think perhaps that the oil could potentially be filtered to remove a lot of these contaminants and thereby make the system better? And that's mistake number 2. Mistake number 2 is addressing a symptom rather than addressing a cause. Right? It's not to say we don't address symptoms, but if that's the only thing you're going to do, the problem will simply return again. So we need to be aware that we should identify why it's being contaminated and go after that so that once we filter it, it will stay back in shape. And that's one of the big issues that I have with the way a lot of people interpret their oil analysis reports is that they simply change the oil. Right? As soon as a report looks bad, they change the oil, which guarantees that yes, probably the next report will look good, but that doesn't mean you fixed anything mechanical or logistical with why those samples are looking so bad and what's being damaged or degraded. So we should go after the root causes. In the case of this one here, probably something to do with an ingression of contamination. Could be something as simple as the breather. Right? If it was a breather like this that wouldn't offer much protection, that would be your explanation right there. Right? If we simply upgraded that breather, we could probably get away with less filtration in the future. But the third and most common mistake I find is, did you focus on just the alarms, right? And when you do, you look at these bad things on the report and you see that there's a lot of wear, there's a lot of contamination, and you think, you know what, I think this bearing's too far gone. Or maybe you think the oil's too far gone, either way you look at it. And you decide that there's nothing you can do about it. It's gone past the point of no return. So this is the third most common mistake, and that is waiting for the reports to catch your attention and then doing whatever you're going to do next. And my sort of simple analogy for this is you're not really keeping oil analysis as being predictive. You're being more reactive. And so my comparison then is using your smoke detector at home to tell you when your muffins are done, right? It's not a good indicator that they're completely cooked. They're probably too far gone at that point. So we're not using, the tools the way they're meant to be used. And kind of the last commentary here and why we're going to go through how to read a report is that you've probably heard this expression, maybe paraphrased a little bit differently. But the thing is, if you don't know how to use a tool properly, it doesn't really matter how many of them you have, right? You need to know how to use these tools properly. In oil analysis, the report itself is a tool. And there are just so many people out there who get, dozens to hundreds of samples, and they file them away, and then something, goes wrong, and they look back and they say, how could I have known this was going to happen? And someone with experience looks back at those reports and said it was telling you the whole time. So that's why I'd like to teach you a little bit better way to read reports. And one of the things I like to point out about why it's important that people understand how to read a report at a greater depth is to ask another question. And that question is, who is ultimately responsible for interpreting an oil analysis report? And of course, many people put that squarely on the shoulders of the lab. And they say, well, that's what we're paying you for. Well, you're paying the lab for quite a few things, actually. You're paying the lab for accurate numbers. That's first and foremost what you want to get out of your money. What you're asking them as a favor almost is to offer you a high-level interpretation of those numbers based on their experience. Because what I think that you have to consider is that lab's knowledge is very limited. Now, one of the things they know quite well is test limitations, right? They know how far a test can go in terms of how much material can it actually analyze, what size of material, how small, how large it can go. They know the repeatability, the reproducibility. They know the errors on the instruments. They know what real changes look like. So they have an idea what numbers are supposed to look like. They have an idea when they don't look right. They do have some idea as to equipment metallurgy, right? The basics of what comprises a shaft versus a bearing versus different types of bearings or different types of gears as examples. And this knowledge is kind of a shared knowledge. So they have some idea, what sources could have indicated those wear patterns. They have ideas as to what type of contamination looks like via different analysis. But the last thing they bring to the table is the biggest tool of all they have anyways is trending, right? They can bring trend analysis into your numbers and look back on the history, and they can identify when the trend, though it may look actually at a reasonable level, the current data, the trend indicates it's not following the pattern. It's not staying where it normally would be. And so with these trends, they can identify the abnormalities, the anomalies, and help identify things you should pay more attention to. On the other hand, one of the other people who can do a good report interpretation is not the lab, but rather the end user. So what does the end user bring to the table? Well, they generally bring everything that the lab can bring, but they have a few other things up their sleeve. Number one, they know all about the sample procedure and location, right? If the lab gets a result with a particularly high water content to it, they will send back the report saying you have a high water content and suggest you investigate it. On the other hand, if the end user knows that they sent somebody different to collect that sample and that sample point is at a low point drain, they get one report back with a high water content, they might immediately dismiss that as an anomaly from poor sampling. They might think the person they sent to sample it didn't properly flush the sample point, and they'll get a resample to confirm before they act on anything. So these kinds of things the end user starts to have much more of an advantage of than anyone in a lab could ever have. Now, the next thing that the end user can bring is they understand how their equipment's configured. They know if that machine shares its oil with another machine, if there's any sort of filtration that's available on the machine that could reduce the results or skew them in any way, shape, form. They also have an idea of the overall operating conditions, right? Does it operate in a dry environment, a humid environment, a dirty environment, anything like this that could lead to certain contaminants appearing and just being par for the course. So that's a key one when it comes to interpreting contaminants. But another one they know is maintenance activity, right? They know if it's been topped off, if it's had its oil changed, if there's been anything major done to it, parts replaced, and this can have a great impact on the degradation properties and the wear metals. So when you start to consider what the end user has at their disposal compared to the lab, you should start to feel that maybe the end user is the one who should do most of the interpretation. And that's what I'm here to try and teach you. So what I'd like to show you now is the 3 basic steps to get through any oil analysis report, like I said, quickly and efficiently so that you can come up with an actionable item. So step 1 sounds very easy, but I assure you it takes a little bit more patience than you might think. Read the whole report. And by the whole report, I don't just mean all the data the lab has provided you. I actually mean read the parts of the report that the end user provided some data for and assess the whole picture, right? Don't interpret as we go, all those kinds of mistakes I pointed out. We're going to read the whole report. Now in step 2, as we read this whole report, we're not going to interpret as we go. The only thing we're going to interpret is the result abnormal? This could be too high, too low, too different from trend, too different from the previous sample, too different from the new oil. Whatever reason you have for believing that sample doesn't look like a good result, right? Any individual parameter. What I want next is to only decide as far as is it a cause or is it an effect. Don't try and think what's it causing or don't try and decide what it's an effect of. Just ask yourself, would this be a cause? Would this make other things happen? Or is this the result of something else? And I'll give you a big clue. Wear metals, almost always an effect. Right? Something's making it wear. You have to decide what that is. See if the report can tell you. Now, as we go through this report and we start looking at the causes, we're going to find that they're going to group together quite nicely. And most of your causes should group together in one group. They should all be related. They might need a second group, but that's usually as far as it goes, 1 or 2 groups. Everything else in the report you identified as abnormal, you're simply going to say it's an effect. And once we get to step 3, we're going to look at those couple of groups or one group of causes and decide what to do next. And in what to do next, we can either confirm a suspected problem, eliminate a suspected problem, or sometimes we're pretty sure exactly what's going on wrong and we can just go out there and repair it. So with those 3 steps in mind, let's now reattempt that report and do it the new way. So for those of you not familiar with the layout of a test oil report, let me point out a couple of things before we get too deep into this. When we look at a report, we're going to read this whole report, but I will point out once we get to the data section that there is a part that's called the new oil column. And this is where the baseline information appears. So this is a sample of virgin oil sent into us, and that's the data from it. So it's your best case scenario how good the oil looks. Next, you'll see to it a column that is the most current sample. And as you move further and further to the right, you will see older and older data. So when you read this report, you're actually reading it from right to left to see those trends. But with that, let me now walk you through this report, and we will start at the very top, and we're going to read the whole report. So when I say the top, I do mean the top. So at the top there it says anti-friction bearing. So in your mind, you're already getting a picture of what does this look like. For sump size, it's unknown. We don't know. All right, so this could be a small bearing, could be a large bearing. We don't have that much information. However, it does say it's using an R&O 46, or sorry, an AW, not R&O, AW 46 fluid. And AW, what that tells us right away is at least 2 things. It tells us that we should expect phosphorus and zinc because the most common anti-wear additive is the ZDDP or zinc dialkyl dithiophosphate, and it contains both zinc and phosphorus in it at relatively equal concentrations. So it's one of those things that just prompts us as to what we're going to expect to see later. Now the 46 tells us that we're expecting a 46 centistoke oil at 40 degrees Celsius. So again, these are things I expect to find, and if I don't, that would indicate abnormal data. Now we can keep reading. There's the make, the model of the bearing. Moving over to the right, there's the date the sample was submitted and the date this report went out. And then of course we've got our customer name way at the far right. I always encourage people, and it sounds like I'm joking, but I say read it. Check to make sure it's your report, because if you're not, well, you'd be done already. But in all seriousness, read it to make sure you know exactly which location this is coming from, because many of our customers monitor multiple locations, and that's where the location would be given, right? So you know exactly which plant, which facility it's coming from. And seriously, it only takes you about a half a second worth of glancing to go, yeah, that's me. So as you keep reading the report, you're going to move down to the next section where it lists all the problems. So that's just a list of the problems, but to the right of it are the comments. And you're going to find a comment for every one of those problems. Now again, being fair, those comments are a little bit middle of the road. They are pre-written, so they are standardized format, the spelling's correct and all that kind of good stuff. But they are actually hand-selected through, human eye revision of your report. And that's a very common question I get. Is people ask, well, don't the computers just comment on the reports? It's like, well, computers are capable of doing that, but computers just follow basic rules. And a human can sometimes reinterpret those rules and say, nah, I think that's okay. And sometimes they go, I know it looks okay, but I don't have a good feeling about it. So we use human eye review to make sure that we've given your report one pass with, some reasonable logic that just can't be programmed by a computer. But in the end of the day, yes, when the human says, I think we should make a comment about wear metals, it is a pre-written comment. And why I mention this is one of the most frequent complaints that I receive regarding how reports are laid out. People always have an opinion as to, what data should appear first or whatnot, but the most common thing they complain about is the comments. And they say, I've had 3 reports in a row and you've commented the same way all 3 times. And honestly speaking, I kind of like that complaint, because when somebody gives me a complaint like that, I can just retort, you keep not fixing it, right? If you want a different comment on a report, something has to change. And the easiest way to change something is make a change, right? Make a repair, make an improvement, do something. If you don't, it's going to continue to look the same. You're going to continue to see the same comments. But after you read the comments, you're now ready to move on to the next part of the report. And like I said, this is the part that takes patience. Because again, as soon as people go on to the next part of the report, they immediately think I mean the data. And I still don't mean the data. In the next part of the report, just below the header there, you see all the information directly related to the sample that would have been provided by the end user. So starting on the far right, you can see the first sample date of the oldest sample on this report. And what I want you to notice is as you move along, what the increments look like, what the intervals between samples appear to be. So from the first to the second sample, you're going to see about 2 weeks. From the second to the third, about 4 weeks. And from the third to the fourth, again, about 4 weeks. So that tells you right there that the first sample's got the shortest interval when it goes to the second sample, but the next 2 intervals, the second to the third and the third to the fourth, are about equal. So if you're picturing what the trend would look like in your mind, there'd be a bigger jump between the second and the third and the fourth sample than there should be between the first and the second sample, just because the intervals are longer on those 2. If you keep reading down, though, you're going to see machine hours and lube hours. Now, what's interesting about this is machine hours for the very first sample are 0, meaning this was a brand new piece of equipment. But the other interesting thing is that the lube hours have not changed in any way different than the machine hours. So what that tells me is, of course, yes, the lubricant was new when the machine was new, but there has not been an oil change this whole time. So again, what does that tell me about the trends I should expect to find? I should not expect the trends to ever change direction, right? Because when you change the oil, certain things improve. So certain numbers go down, certain numbers come up. In this case, I should expect all numbers to move in one direction and one direction only. And, like I said, I should expect a smaller change between the first and second samples versus the second and third and the third and the fourth. So this is why we read the whole report, because it's going to help with our interpretation. But now as we get to the actual data part, all we have to do is, like I said, is identify abnormal data. And the first piece of data that most people identify as abnormal, well, would be the iron, of course. So they see the iron, and like I said, all we have to do is decide if it's a cause or an effect. And I gave you a bit of a hint. So if we're keeping track here, it's an effect, right? Let's just call it an effect. Now, as we move back to the report and look for the next piece of data we don't like, the next piece of data that looks abnormal, we're going to settle on that lead, right? And again, if we go back to our tally here and decide where to put it, again, it's just an effect. Once we return to the report, again, though, we keep looking down and we try and identify the next piece of data that we see as being abnormal. And a lot of people stop on calcium, right? They look at this calcium value and they say, well, wait a minute. That's significantly different than the new oil value. I think that looks abnormal. And, they're not wrong, but I don't think it's a concern. And here's why I don't think it's a concern. The very first sample, the one furthest to the right, is a sample at 0 hours. So that is new oil. That is brand new fluid in there. And at that sample, the calcium value is really not that much different than the most current sample. So if you look at the trend the whole way along, it's a fairly flat trend. So what does this tell me? Well, it can tell me two things. One, it could tell me that my new oil reference is out of date. That is a possibility that we could consider, that maybe this oil that we have here representing Conoco AW46 is not what Conoco AW46 looks like today. Another probably simpler explanation is that oil is not Conoco AW46. And of course, that could be concerning for some people because it would mean the wrong oil was added to the machine. But given that this was a new machine, here's my thought. Is what you would call factory fill versus shop fill. Right? The shop, the plant, the facility, wherever this is located, does use Conoco AW46. But I'm wagering whatever was put into this is an AW46. It just doesn't happen to be Conoco brand. So given that it's a flat trend, I don't think there's much of a concern about the calcium value. But like I said, it's good that we looked at it and said, I don't know if it's normal or not normal. But just because it doesn't compare to the new oil value doesn't mean it's not normal when the trend is flat the whole way along. Of course, if you keep going down the report, probably one of the next ones that's going to jump out at you is that phosphorus, right? You look down at the phosphorus, you're probably going to come to the same conclusion that, yes, it doesn't look like the new oil, but it does appear to be a very flat trend from the first sample. And if you keep reading, you of course immediately stop on zinc as well, and you're going to come to that same conclusion. So that's all we found on the top of the first page, just iron and the lead. But if we keep going down to the second half of the first page, we're going to read down, and some people, they stop on silicon. So you can agree or disagree whether or not you think silicon's a problem, but a lot of people don't like it because it appears to have doubled between the third sample and the fourth sample. That's a fair comment. If you look at the previous sample results, they were actually a little bit higher. So maybe it's not that much of an increase. Maybe the 7 is just a bit of a low reading, but whatever. If you believe it's abnormal, you still have to find a way to classify it, cause or an effect. And the easiest way to answer that question is to ask yourself, well, would iron and lead cause silicon to appear? Or could silicon cause iron and lead to appear? And so when you consider that and you think, where do I place it on my list? It does sound like it could be a cause. It does sound like silicon, being quite commonly from things like dust, could be abrasive and cause wear metals to appear. So we'll call silicon a cause. Now, if we keep reading down the report, the next thing we're going to stop at here is this other fluid value. Now, other fluid is a bit of a tricky one because other fluid is not a measure of how much other fluid is there. Other fluid is an infrared parameter, and so therefore we're measuring the absorbance at a certain wavelength of infrared light. And you can see in this new oil sample that value would be baseline 40, but the current sample is 118. Now, again, a lot of people might be concerned about that, but again, I'll say look at the very first sample in this report, and it was pretty much the same result. It's been a flat trend this whole time. So that to me is extra confirmation. This cannot be either Conoco AW46, or at least the new oil reference we have for Conoco AW46 is not as up to date as this formulation. But like I said, I think simplest answer is it was shot fill of some other AW46. So when we look at this, we go, that's a flat trend. We don't need to worry about that. So we'll just move on. Next piece of data, though, that we see as being abnormal, and we'll treat this as a whole, we won't go through line by line, is the particle count. Right? We don't need the line by line interpretation of the particle count. We just know overall the whole thing way higher than it has been. That seems to be a bit alarming. But this is the tricky question. Is the particle count a cause or an effect? Right? Is the particle count high and that's what's causing things like iron and lead to appear? Or is the particle count a result of the iron and lead? Like, is it actually just iron and lead particles? So for that one, when we come to our list here, you know, do we call it a cause? Do we call it an effect? It's a bit of an open question. So let's just leave it as a question mark for now. Again, like I said, we're not here to interpret as we go. We're just here to classify. So we keep reading the report and we look down at the viscosity. Now remember, I did say it was a 46, and what's the viscosity? That's near perfect. So that confirms to us that yes, at least this is a 46. It did have relatively equal quantities of phosphorus and zinc. It looks like it's an AW oil. So it is an AW46. Like I said, it just probably isn't conical. But we keep reading and we see things like acid number, and some people think, ooh, acid number is climbing. That's pretty bad. But again, look at the intervals on this. How much did it increase from the first sample to the second sample? 0.02. How much did it increase from the second to the third? 0.04. And how much did it increase from the third to the fourth? 0.04. And what were the sampling intervals again? 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks. And it went up by 0.02, 04, 04. That is a perfectly linear trend. In fact, that almost looks like I made up the numbers, right? And if I was making up numbers, I actually wouldn't even make them up to be that exact, because it just doesn't seem believable. But this is a real report, and that is the trend, and that is exactly the kind of trend you're looking for. So there's nothing abnormal with viscosity or acid number, but when you do get down to the bottom of the report, you see water content, that's going to jump out. All right, look at the water values. They went from 90 ppm to over 400 ppm, over 3,000 ppm, and they're now nearly 7,000 ppm. Right, that is an abnormal trend. So is water a cause or effect? Well, for keeping tally here, it is definitely a cause. Right? So we're going to put it in the cause column. But now we can move on to the last page of the report. And on the last page of the report, ferrography, there's usually one good reason you're going to see a ferrography result at all on a report, and that's because we automatically add ferrographies to any report with a high wear metal count or a high ferrous wear concentration. So generally when you get one of these on a report without having asked for one, it's because we've already identified that there's going to be problems there. We've identified that there's a high level of wear metals in your oil, so it's not unusual to see that your ferrography results tend to be high as well. So the first one that we see that's too high, well, rubbing wear. Right? In rubbing wear, the particles are quite large. They're bigger than clearances. So is rubbing wear a cause or effect? Well, if we're keeping track, just an effect. Right? Next one on the list, you're going to see is sliding wear. So sliding wear is also very high, and the particles are even larger. So sliding wear is definitely an abnormal value here. Again, if we're keeping track, where do we put it? Well, sliding wear is also just an effect. Keep moving down the list, though. You're going to get down to the corrosion. Corrosion is our next one here. We shouldn't see signs of corrosion in an oil sample. That's bad. And you go, is corrosion a cause or an effect? Well, again, probably just an effect. I'll wager it's an effect of that water. But like I said, we're not here to decide that yet. We keep reading down the report, and of course we don't get much more than one line below, and we see dark metallic oxides, which are wear particles generated by adhesive wear, by great contact between metal-to-metal parts. So under such high pressures that they temporarily weld to each other, and then the heat that's created during this welding anneals the metals, which is why they turn dark. And then as the pieces keep moving relatively to each other, some chunks tear off. It's an incredibly aggressive, I should say, wear mechanism, one you don't like to see. So this is definitely bad to see values here. But again, is that a cause or an effect? Well, on our list here, it's simply an effect. Move down the list. The next one you see there is red oxides. Is red oxides abnormal? Sure, right? Those are rust particles found in your oil. That's not normal. Is it a cause or effect? Well, again, you bet it is an effect. Get down to the last part of the analytical ferrography, and we're going to see dust and dirt. So we've identified dust and dirt as abnormal. Is that a cause or effect? Well, that seems like if we're keeping track here, we can probably put that under the column of cause, right? Probably closely related to the silicon value. So now that we've seen all the data, we do need to revisit that bottom half of the first page where we identified particle count as being abnormally high. And we need to decide now, is it a cause or is it an effect? Because we left it open-ended and said, we don't know. But now that we've seen everything, what do you think? Well, hopefully you're thinking here, if I was going to pick it, I'd take it off the effects column and I'd leave it in the causes column. So we've identified these four causes, right? We've got our silicon, we've got our particle count, we've got water, and then from the analytical ferrography, we've got dust and dirt. Right, everything else we saw, all the iron, the lead, and all the other wear material, those were all just effects. So we can group those causes together, and we can probably say the silicon, the particle count, and the dust and dirt are all related to each other. The water, that seems like a separate issue. And we're going to focus on the causes as we decide what to do next, and we don't need to worry about the effects. Right? If we take care of the causes, we'll take care of the effects too. But we're focused on the causes. So just returning to the first page of the report as a reminder, right? This is an anti-friction bearing, so we see signs of contamination getting into it. We see signs of wear. We've decided that the contamination is the cause, the wear is the effect. What do we do next? So at this point, I generally get quite a few different suggestions, and some people suggest, well, change the oil. And I go, well, you haven't been listening so far. But let's entertain that thought. Let's say they do change the oil. Now, it took us 4 samples to figure out there was a problem. If we change the oil, how many samples before we know if the problem's fixed? Probably another 4 samples, right? So that's not a very timely way of knowing we actually made a proper corrective action. I said, but what if we do something else than change the oil? What if we leave the oil in place? What else would we do? And sort of the go-to answer most people have is, well, go look for why the dirt's getting in there. And that's a great answer, right? Let's go check this bearing, because I'll wager there's something obvious wrong with it. Now, it could be a fill cap is not on tight, or maybe not on at all. Could be if this thing had a dipstick, that the dipstick has popped out and it's laying on the ground, and there's an opening into the system that way. Could be a number of points of entry into that bearing, but probably first and foremost in everyone's mind is it could be a breather, right? Let's go check the breather, right? And there could be any number of breather designs that appear on this particular bearing housing, but I'm wagering it's further to the left of this picture than it is to the right of this picture. Because if we have high amounts of dirt and dust getting in there, we probably don't have a great breather on here. So right away, if we found that we were using one of the lesser quality breathers, we might consider upgrading to a higher quality breather. Or if we're only using, sort of the mid quality, we'd consider upgrading to the highest quality. Right? That could be what it is. But let's just say, hypothetically, that whatever's wrong with this bearing is obvious from 30 feet away. Right? Somebody walking up to this bearing to go do an inspection for how did the dirt get in there can spot the problem from 30 feet away. It's just that obvious, right? The breather's damaged, the dipstick's out, the fill cap's off, whatever it was. So hypothetically speaking, it's that bad. So obviously they correct it. My question is, if they correct it, what do you do next? And again, I get a lot of people who might suggest, well, change the oil, right? You know what's wrong, so change the oil. And I would repeat that argument that it would take 4 samples before we know if we actually fixed it. I said, but if we leave the oil in, how many samples do we have to wait before we know we found the actual source of the problem? And most people are pretty quick to answer, only 1. So then I ask you, okay, that's good, but when is that 1 sample going to be taken? Right? Because a lot of people, they make a change and their temptation, not necessarily saying they follow up on this, but their temptation is to resample right away. And I tell people, I said, if you resample it within a day, how do you know it worked? And they go, oh yeah, I guess you're right. And I say, well, how long should you wait? And they go, well, I should definitely wait at least a week or 2 then. And I go, no. This particular bearing was being sampled, as best as we can tell, from the last 3 samples every month, once a month, every 4 weeks, however you want to think of that. So you wait an absolutely normal interval, right? If you shorten the interval, it changes how that trend appears. So no, we wait a whole month and leave it in. And I go, if we wait that 1 month and sample it, and the results come back, what would the results look like in terms of knowing that you actually fixed the problem? Would they be higher, would they be lower, or would they be about the same? And again, most people will decide that about the same is what they're going to expect. I mean, in fairness, yes, some of the wear may continue to increase, but the contamination level should become status quo. There shouldn't be any increases to that. But again, without making any other changes, there should be no decreases either. So that's how we would know we effectively found the root cause and fixed the problem. So then people say, but wait a minute. That may stop more from getting in, but you clearly have too much there already. So they start saying, why don't we add filtration? And they go, well, that's a great thought. I said, give me a micron rating of a filter you'd run on this. And sometimes people give me really high answers, like 30 microns or 20 microns even. But let's pretend the answer is 10 microns. So if somebody says, I'd throw a 10 micron filter on that would clean everything up. I go, well, will it? Elemental spectroscopy focuses on particles in the 0 to 5 micron range. So actually, in effect, you shouldn't see a drop in the iron and lead based on filtration alone. You just won't see any continued increase. And then I look at the particle counts, which particle counting goes 4, 6, and 14 microns are the ones we focus on. And I go, again, 10 micron filter is only going to really touch the 14 micron value. So I caution people when they simply think filtration will fix everything, make the whole report look better. Because what I'll also point out is I said, a particulate filter is not going to take out the water. And that's when they go, oh, right, forgot about the water. I go, exactly. So I said, what filtration should we use? And so we're looking for a number that's like 3 microns or even lower if we want to see a reduction in the iron, a reduction in the lead, a reduction in most of the particle count, and it's going to need some sort of desiccant aspect to that filter. Much like we have desiccant breathers, you can have a desiccant oil filter to actually absorb the water out of there. Otherwise, we'll have to wait for the water to evaporate slowly, which won't be as immediate of change as particle count would be. But in the end, we are deciding what to do next. And one of the key things that people bring up when they look at this particular result is they say, well, this is all well and good. I appreciate your discussion. I said, but I would never leave that oil in service for another month. They go, it's too far gone, right? And that's a great point. I love it when people bring up that point, and I always tell them, I said, you just fell into a trap. And they go, well, what do you mean? I said, well, here's my point. If I label these samples now, just so we're clear, this is sample number 1, sample 2, sample 3, sample 4. I said, if you follow this method for reading reports and do them quickly and efficiently and get to the root cause of every one of your problems, I said, on which report would you have actually caught the problem here? When people look back at the results and see how iron jumped in the 3rd sample, how lead appeared for the first time in the 3rd sample, you can keep reading down. You would look at particle count increased in the 3rd sample, and water content went from 400 ppm up to 3,200 ppm, right? It's almost an 8 times increase. And people, are pretty quick to say, yeah, I would have seen it on the 3rd sample. I said, exactly. And I said, had we stopped at the 3rd sample, would you have been willing to leave that oil in for an additional month? And usually I get a lot of head shakes going, yeah, you're right. And I go, exactly. I said, that's why I'm teaching you how to read every report. And I mean every report. And like I said, not just the alarmed reports. Because if you can take the time to read every report, you're actually making your oil analysis predictable, right? Predictive technology. If you wait for the alarms to go off, it's a reaction. So it's reactive technology. And that's not what it was intended for, right? And that is the most common mistake that I do find people doing, at least one of the top 3 anyways, is that they don't read every report. If it looks largely, a green report, so to speak, one with no alarms on it, everything is identified as normal, they don't bother reading it. But then when they do finally get a report with alarms on it, they're always like, I wonder if we could have seen this coming. It's like, well, you can, right? Read every report, top to bottom. Look for the abnormalities, identify if they're causes or effects, go investigate the causes, right? Very simple steps. They're not meant to be complicated. Like I said, you can use this on any oil analysis report, regardless of how much data is there, and you will find it gets you to the root of your problems and not just a bunch of the symptoms. So with that, let me summarize. The whole presentation is saying this. The point of these 3 steps is to simplify the way you read reports, because if you do this, you're going to identify, as I said, the true root cause. You're not going to chase the symptoms. You're going to make your oil analysis a predictive technology, not a reactive technology. You're going to have the time to read every report, right? And that's the big benefit here. This is what takes your program's effectiveness up a notch, and this is, of course, also what affects your bottom line investment to the whole program, right? You get a higher return on your investment. So there's no reason not to read reports this way, and hopefully you've seen this as a valuable insight for just how to get through the report. So with that, I will thank you so much for your time. If you've been enjoying the presentations, if you do have any questions, I'll leave it open for about 30 seconds here. But if not, I'll simply end the presentation. So again, thank you so much for your participation.